So a lot of people seem to like my last video looking at whether Belarus was going to get involved in Ukraine, so I decided to make another video looking at another aspect of the conflict, and this is the potential for Russia to use nuclear weapons in its fight against Ukraine. Now, as I mentioned in the previous video, in recent months things haven't been going very well for the Russians. From a height in March when they controlled large parts of the south, east and north of the country, now in October we see that this has shrunk away to only having some areas in the east and the south of the country, those areas that hadn't been occupied since 2014, that is. As we've seen footage coming in from various sites, we see Ukrainian forces liberating settlement after settlement in continuous assaults. It's likely they're trying to liberate as much as possible before the winter sets in and before this gets harder. And actually just today, the day of recording this video, the bridge between the Crimean Peninsula and the Russian mainland was also hit by a strike, most likely by Ukrainians, whether that by special forces or by some kind of other attack. We're not entirely sure, but this is a great blow to the Russian infrastructure and resupply in the south, and particularly in terms of Crimea too. So more bad news for the Russians, which leads many of us to now wonder, what will Putin do to regain the initiative? Because quite clear from this is that the Ukrainians currently have the initiative in this war. They dictate what the next move is going to be, and when you're invading a country, that is not the situation you want to be in. Just days after the invasion began on the 27th of February, Putin already placed Russia's nuclear weapons on high alert, which already caused a frenzy in the media and fears that this might be escalation towards using a nuclear weapon. Of course, in February, the Russians had hoped that this would be a 4-day campaign in which they would capture the vital hubs of Ukraine and defeat the army. Of course, now we're in a rather different situation. And on the 28th of September, there was once again what might be referred to as nuclear saber rattling, when he announced that he would use all force and means necessary in order to safeguard Russia. So what kind of nuclear capabilities does Russia have? In terms of intercontinental ballistic missiles, so these are the long-range systems that can be shot off the warheads placed on a missile, there are 1,185. They also have a large force of nuclear weapons on submarines that can be launched from the ocean. These number around 800, and the remaining 580 that are currently deployed are deployed as ones that can be dropped from the air, so obviously by bombers and the like. And of course there are actually more nuclear weapons than this, but these are just the ones that are deployed. There's a total of 5,977, although a larger part of that is clearly in storage, and how operational that is another question. But to briefly compare that with the other largest holders of nuclear weapons, Russia is in fact the country with the most nuclear weapons on Earth. Falling just under that, we have the NATO umbrella. This can be broken down into the USA, which by far has the largest amount, France, which has several hundred, and the United Kingdom, which has a similar number, although fewer than France. And the next largest holder of nuclear weapons is China, with just 350. So we can see obviously that Russia and NATO are the two sort of blocks with the most nuclear capability in the world, and it really is a frightening amount of power that is held within these two nations. Something that can give us an indication about how and when Russia might use a nuclear weapon is its nuclear doctrine. Most countries will have very clear nuclear doctrine as a kind of warning system. If you press these buttons, if you take these actions against our nation, then you might face a nuclear reaction. But these are quite limited in the case of Russia. There are in fact 4 points. Point number 1 is the arrival of reliable data on a launch of ballistic missiles attacking the territory of the Russian Federation and or its allies. This is basically if a nuclear strike is launched against Russia by another nation, if that data has already come in, then Russia can send out its own nuclear missiles to the target of this attack, presumably, as this enables mutually ensured or assured destruction. But I'll talk about that in a second. The second condition is the use of nuclear weapons or other types types of weapons of mass destruction by an adversary against the Russian Federation and or its allies. So that's already if a nuclear weapon has been detonated or another weapon of mass destruction, whether biological or chemical, for example. The third is an attack by an adversary against critical governmental or military sites of the Russian Federation, disruption of which would undermine nuclear forces' response actions. So this is essentially an attack, a not nuclear attack, but on a nuclear launch site, for example, or the critical infrastructure for launching nuclear weapons. And the fourth is aggression against the Russian Federation with the use of conventional weapons when the very existence of the state is in jeopardy. So this is, let's say, if there are troops moving on Moscow or St. Petersburg and it doesn't look like the Russians will be able to fight them back, then they will be allowed to use nuclear weapons within the doctrine. Of course, this is the military doctrine, and that doesn't have to be followed to the letter, but it's likely that Russian use of nuclear weapons will actually follow the nuclear doctrine as it's laid out. The problem here is that one might say, well, okay, so this all pertains to Russia itself and its allies. And because Russia is in Ukraine, as long as Ukraine doesn't then cross the border and start attacking Russian nuclear sites, then they should be fine. But the issue is who is defining what is meant by Russia here, because of course since 2014, the 17th of March, Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula following a referendum that was held there, and so the Russians, Vladimir Putin, think of Crimea as being a part of Russia that has been a part of the country for around 7 or 8 years. Furthermore, the day before the actual invasion of Ukraine, on the 21st of February of this year, Putin actually recognized the two rebel republics that had broken away from Ukraine in Donetsk and Luhansk, and actually recognized them as states and therefore as allies of Russia. And that is, of course, one of the provisos that they can also intervene on behalf of their allies. Now, on the 30th of September, Russia held yet more elections in classic dubious style in parts of the regions they had conquered in Ukraine in the latest invasion. And they now see this as being part of Russia as well, as they announced that it would be annexed into Russia. So now, from Putin's point of view, this area of Kherson, Zaporizhia, and the Donbass all count as parts of Russia. And so if a Ukrainian attack is attacking these regions, which they currently are in their counteroffensives, because of course the rest of the world recognizes this as being Ukraine, not Russia, that is then a conflict of interest. And so Russia technically, with its military doctrine, in certain circumstances might be able to justify the use of nuclear weapons in this case. Of course, the point is that large parts of this area that Putin claims is Russia are actually under the control of Ukrainian forces, and they are constantly pushing the Russians further back. However, if this reaches a critical point, then Putin might feel it necessary to use these kinds of weapons to gain an advantage and to stop the counteroffensives from happening. But is this likely? If the Russians were to decide on using nuclear weapons, it would likely be in the form of a tactical nuclear weapon or a low-yield weapon. Now, don't let the name confuse you. These are still weapons of mass destruction, quite literally. But it probably wouldn't be the kind of nuclear Armageddon scenario that is sometimes imagined and portrayed by the media, at least not initially. Part of the reason why is because if Putin does believe that he will be able to retake the territory in these regions that he is claiming to have annexed into Russia, it doesn't make sense to drop nuclear weapons there because of the radiation and the fallout and the destruction. If Russia wants to claim a territory, it doesn't make sense to drop a weapon of mass destruction there because, of course, it destroys what will later be a part of the Russian Federation. Furthermore, it makes it far more difficult for Russian troops to then fight in this area with the required equipment needed, and given Russia's already lacking equipment, it doesn't really make sense to add that difficulty. Therefore, I think as things stand now, with the proximity of Ukrainian and Russian forces on the front, there's not really a clear area on the front, at least, where they would drop such a tactical nuclear weapon against Ukrainian forces. That leads to another possibility that they might actually drop it on Kyiv, because of course Russian forces are no longer around Kyiv. This is the center of Ukrainian fight back against the Russians. It's where the government is housed and a lot of logistics are, so potentially that could be a target. There are a few reasons why I think this is unlikely, however. First of all, for Putin, Kyiv is actually an incredibly important city. As a devout Orthodox Christian, or so he claims, and particularly in terms of his statements that Russians and Ukrainians are the same people, Kyiv is the wellspring of that civilization, of the Kievan Rus, and the place where Orthodox Christianity was for a long time housed and spread to other lands as well. So I think it's highly unlikely that for Putin he would be able to bring himself to completely destroy this city that has such an important role in the religion that he adheres to and holds dear, and has actually based a large part of his image upon. Secondly, there is a political reason why a nuclear strike on Kyiv might be suicidal for not only the world, but especially for Putin himself. And this is because Kyiv is quite close to the border of several NATO countries. The Baltic states are not very far away, neither are Poland or some of the other Central European countries, all of which are in NATO. If a nuclear weapon is deployed and there is radiation and fallout that spreads across the border, then that might actually be grounds for NATO to trigger Article 5, the fact that NATO can go to war if a member state is attacked by another nation. And this could then be triggered and lead to a greater war against the Russians. Several NATO states have already responded to this probability, including the United States, with President Joe Biden saying he is not joking when he talks about the potential use of tactical nuclear weapons. I don't think there's any such thing as an ability to easily use a tactical nuclear weapon and not end up with Armageddon. So clearly the Americans are being quite strong on this, that this is a very ill-advised move if Putin is to use nuclear weapons for obvious reasons, but also mention the possibility of escalation and that the United States might then return fire, so to speak, with its own nuclear arsenal. This is a concept that is known as mutually assured destruction. The idea behind the nuclear deterrent is that these weapons are so terrible and that can possibly end life on the earth that if one nation is going to use them, then they will also be destroyed by the nuclear weapons of the nation that they are attacking, or an ally of that nation that has nuclear weapons. And so the initial use of nuclear weapons isn't to be advised because it will assure the user's own destruction. And so that is what Joe Biden is hinting at here. And obviously this is not a good scenario because this threatens everyone outside of Ukraine and Russia as well, the two belligerents of the conflict. However, I don't think we should be too worried about it at this stage. For one is the very simple fact that this is a lose-lose. No one here gets what they want if there is mutually assured destruction. It sounds like an obvious thing to say, but it's worth bearing in mind. Putin does not want mutually assured destruction because it means his death, it means the death of Russia, it means the end of his ambitions in Ukraine. The Americans, they don't want mutually assured destruction because, well, ditto, to be honest, and neither do the Ukrainians because no one wins out of this scenario. What has been said quite a bit in various media sources is a potential Russian doctrine of escalate to de-escalate. The idea that the Russians may use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine to so frighten the Ukrainians and the West that they back down and give Putin what he wants. However, it's worth mentioning that this has actually been denied by the Russians themselves. Not that that means much because the Russians also said they weren't going to invade Ukraine about a week before they invaded Ukraine. But this is more of a Western approach to Russian mentality than a Russian one that is actually reflected in the nuclear doctrine. Second of all, it seems that this quite simply wouldn't work, not least because NATO powers, and particularly the United States, are saying that if there is use of a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, then Russia will be able to expect an answer from NATO. Whether that strike hits a NATO country or not, it seems likely that there would be another repercussion from NATO and their allies. Because there have been sanctions now since February, it seems that this would be a huge escalation, but it's not clear that this would lead to de-escalation from NATO in terms of its position on Russia, particularly as Russia has signed several treaties for nuclear non-proliferation and for eventually getting rid of their nuclear arsenal, and of course for not using them. What's also interesting actually is that Russia still informs the United States of any movements of its nuclear weapons at all times, and this again is likely for if there are any mistakes or if there are movements and someone gets a little bit trigger happy, so to say, on the other end, that there aren't any mistakes, because these can be obviously world-ending mistakes. But the fact that this communication pipeline has been upheld for this far makes me think that this isn't a likely outcome. There is also a lesson to be learned from history here, because this by far isn't the only time that a nuclear-armed power has been on the losing end of a war and haven't used nuclear missiles. So if we go through, there has been a grand total of one time in history, or one conflict in history, that saw nuclear weapons used, and that is of course the Pacific War as part of the Second World War, when the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs, nuclear weapons, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, which ended the war. Bearing in mind that this made the Americans the winner, they weren't actually losing at that point. But there are several other conflicts. I think these are most of the conflicts involving nuclear-armed powers where nuclear weapons weren't used. So in the Vietnam War, of course, the United States of America pulled out of that war and went on to lose that war, yet there was no use of nuclear weapons. China also lost the Sino-Vietnamese War. They had to pull out without achieving their aims. It was a country on their border, and they also did not use nuclear weapons. We finally have also, of course, in the case of the Soviet Union, the Soviet-Afghan War, there was no use of nuclear weapons there, despite their objectives being failing to achieve their objectives. And the same in the first Chechen War, which was fought by the Russian Federation. That, of course, did lead to another conventional war, the Second Chechen War, but there was no use of nuclear missiles. And in the case of the Kargil War, we actually had 2 nuclear-armed powers, India and Pakistan, that fought one another, and of course there were no nuclear weapons used then either. So that's a little bit of a comfort, hopefully, from history, that it's very unlikely so far that nuclear weapons will be used, even when the nuclear-armed power is on the losing side, simply because of the taboo of using these weapons of mass destruction. So is this then one big bluff coming from Putin? I think it is, and I think it has several tactical functions that to achieve his aims. I think really what we're seeing with this is a threaten to escalate to de-escalate. So by threatening the use of nuclear weapons and by bringing it up and maybe readying 1 or 2 missiles or something like that, I hope that Putin is trying to draw the Ukrainians to the negotiation table and potentially to stop their counteroffensives if they get frightened enough of a nuclear strike, if they don't sort of allow the Russians to maintain what they've held so far, because the Ukrainians are on the front foot, and it looks like the Russians are going to continue losing ground to the Ukrainians as things stand. Perhaps more than that, though, I think this might be aimed at the West, because, of course, the West has been very steadfast in its support of Ukraine, sending large monetary packets as well as, of course, weapons and training the Ukrainians. And it's largely with these weapons, particularly the advanced missile systems like the HIMARS, that the Ukrainians have been able to push back against the Russians with precision strikes, and therefore to weaken their defensive lines and push through in several offensives of their own. However, with this nuclear saber rattling, this is already going everywhere in the media, and quite a lot of people in the West are particularly afraid of it. And so I think they hope that by doing this, that support for Ukraine will weaken even further in this hard winter that we're going into with incredibly high gas prices, etc. Finally, I think it might also actually be for the Russian people, to show the Russians that Putin still has a trick up his sleeve and can still defend Russia and the Russian people by threatening with these nuclear missiles. Of course, the war is still popular in Russia, but with this latest mobilization or partial mobilization that has been announced and carried through, it seems that attitudes might turn. However, by threatening with nuclear missiles, I think that Putin hopes to show that Russia is still able to pack a punch in the war and to bring some good news back. But again, I don't think this is actual evidence that he is going to use nuclear weapons, just as he hasn't throughout the conflict, despite also threatening with them in February and in March. So what do you think in the comments below? Do you think that Putin could use nuclear missiles? Do you think that it's likely that he will? Or do you think that this is again a bluff to try and draw out negotiation and to sever some of the support from the West? Let me know in the comments. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. This video became a lot longer than I thought, but I hope that it's been interesting and that hopefully it sort of calms a few people down who are particularly worried about that. Another really excellent video that I partially used as research for this one is by the YouTuber Perrin, who makes really long, in-depth analyses of what's going on in Ukraine with a particular mind for sort of the, he calls them the spreadsheet warriors, and sort of the infrastructure, the supply behind the front lines that are crucial for the battles. I really enjoyed watching those earlier in the year and indeed still now, so I'll link that in the description below, and I think that would be really interesting. There's another good video I saw about what the scenario might be if a nuclear weapon is used, so I'll also put that in the description. Of course, I sincerely hope that this doesn't go ahead. These are awful things to be talking about, but still I thought it was an interesting topic to make a video on. So thank you all very much for watching. I have been Hilbert and this has been The History.